February wind carved through the gaps in Sarah's cabin walls like a blade seeking warmth to kill. She pressed her shawl tighter around shoulders that had grown thin during the endless winter months, her empty arms aching with a grief that refused to heal. 3 months had passed since the fever took both her newborn son and her husband within the same cruel week, leaving her alone in the Montana wilderness with nothing but memories and the sound of her own breathing. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the rough-hewn walls. Sarah stared into the dying flames, remembering how Thomas used to stack the wood just so, creating a warmth that seemed to embrace the entire room. Now the cold seeped in everywhere, settling into her bones and making her feel ancient at 24. Her rocking chair creaked as she moved back and forth, arms crossed over her chest in an unconscious echo of holding her lost child. The silence pressed against her ears until she could almost hear phantom cries in the wind. She had grown so accustomed to solitude that sometimes she forgot the sound of her own voice. As dawn painted the horizon with pale gold, I wonder where in this vast world you might be listening to this story, and whether morning or evening light is touching your window right now. Sarah rose from her chair, joints protesting after another sleepless night, and moved to add wood to the fire, unaware that this day would change everything. The knock came soft at first, barely audible above the wind's mournful song. Sarah paused with her hand on the coffee pot, wondering if loneliness had finally conjured sounds from thin air. Then it came again, more urgent, accompanied by a sound that made her heart clench with recognition and pain. Crying. The unmistakable wail of infants in distress. Sarah's bare feet carried her across the cold wooden floor faster than thought. She lifted the heavy bar from the door with trembling hands, her mind racing through possibilities. No neighbors lived within 20 miles, and the nearest town lay 2 days' ride through treacherous mountain passes still choked with snow. The door swung open to reveal a sight that stole her breath. A tall Apache man stood on her threshold, his long black hair whipping in the wind, his face etched with exhaustion and desperation. In his powerful arms he cradled 2 tiny bundles, their cries piercing the morning air like arrows. His dark eyes met hers with a mixture of hope and fear. When he spoke, his English came broken but clear, each word weighted with urgency. "Please," he said, his voice rough with cold and sleepless nights. "My babies, they need milk. My wife, she died birthing them. 3 days now, they cry and I have nothing to give." Sarah saw the tremor in his hands, the way his broad shoulders shook with more than cold. Here stood a man reduced to begging from a stranger, his pride stripped away by love for his children. The sight cracked something open in her chest, flooding her with a pain that was somehow also relief. Without hesitation, she stepped aside and gestured him into the warmth. The warmth of the cabin enveloped them like an embrace as Sarah closed the door against the bitter wind. Joseph stood uncertainly in the center of the room, his massive frame seeming to dwarf the modest space, while the babies continued their desperate chorus. Sarah's empty arms ached with recognition, her body remembering what her heart had tried to forget. She moved without conscious thought, reaching for the nearest infant. The tiny girl settled against her chest with a shuddering sigh that went straight to Sarah's soul. Joseph watched with eyes that held both gratitude and wariness, clearly torn between relief and the vulnerability of trusting a stranger with his most precious possessions. Sarah had goat's milk warming by the fire, a habit she had maintained despite having no need for it herself. She prepared the feeding with practiced efficiency, her hands remembering the rhythm of caring for an infant even as her heart broke and healed simultaneously. The baby latched onto the makeshift bottle with desperate hunger, her tiny fist curling around Sarah's finger with surprising strength. Joseph lowered himself into Thomas's chair, cradling the second twin with infinite gentleness. When Sarah looked up from feeding the baby girl, she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher. There was wonder there, and something deeper that made her cheeks warm despite the cold that still clung to her bones. "You are kind," he said quietly, his broken English somehow more eloquent than polished words. "My children, they know good heart. They stop crying for you." Sarah felt tears she had not shed in weeks threaten to spill as the baby in her arms grew heavy with contentment. Night settled over the cabin like a gentle hand, bringing with it a peace Sarah had not known in months. The twins slept fitfully in makeshift beds she had fashioned from dresser drawers lined with her softest quilts. Joseph sat cross-legged on the floor between them, his large frame somehow graceful in the firelight as he watched over his children with unwavering devotion. Sarah moved quietly about the cabin, preparing simple food and marveling at how natural it felt to have others sharing her space. The silence between them held no awkwardness, only the comfortable rhythm of two people united in purpose. When the baby boy stirred and began to fuss, Joseph reached for him with practiced ease while Sarah warmed another bottle. They worked together without words, passing the infant between them as if they had done so for years rather than hours. Sarah found herself studying Joseph's face in the amber light, noting the laugh lines around his eyes despite his current sorrow, the gentle way his calloused hands cradled his son's tiny head. When both babies settled into deeper sleep, Joseph spoke softly into the flickering shadows. "My wife, she would have liked you," he said, his voice carrying both grief and gratitude. "She always said kindness speaks all languages. You speak her language tonight." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief she had carried. For the first time since her losses, she did not feel alone in the world. Outside, the wind continued its lonely song, but within these walls, something warm and precious was taking root. 3 days passed like a gentle dream, each one bringing new rhythms and unexpected harmony. Joseph proved as skilled with his hands as he was gentle with his children, mending the loose shutter that had banged through countless winter storms and reinforcing the door frame where cold had warped the wood. Sarah watched him work, admiring the quiet efficiency with which he moved, never taking more than he gave. In the evenings, after the twins had been fed and settled, Joseph would hum soft melodies in his native tongue. The ancient lullabies seemed to weave through the cabin like golden thread, transforming the space into something sacred. Sarah found herself humming along, her voice blending with his in harmonies that surprised them both. One night, as snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes, Joseph taught her the words to a song his grandmother had sung to him. The Apache syllables felt strange on her tongue at first, but Joseph's patient repetition and gentle corrections made her feel like a student rather than a stranger. When she finally sang a verse alone, his smile lit the cabin brighter than the fire. As I listened to their voices joining together across the divide of different worlds, I find myself wondering about the beautiful diversity in our own world tonight. Where are you experiencing this story from? And have you ever had the joy of learning something meaningful from someone whose culture was different from your own? Sarah discovered that kindness needed no translation, that love spoke in the universal language of careful hands and watchful eyes. The twins began to thrive under their combined care, growing plumper and more content with each passing day. The sound of approaching horses shattered the morning peace like stones through glass. Sarah looked up from where she sat feeding the baby girl, her heart instantly racing as she recognized the voices carrying on the wind. 3 men from town, their words sharp with suspicion and anger even from a distance. Joseph moved with silent efficiency, gathering his few possessions and checking that his knife remained at his side. The easy contentment that had settled over them in recent days evaporated like morning mist, replaced by a tension that made the cabin walls feel suddenly fragile. "Sarah, they come for me," Joseph said quietly, his dark eyes already resigned to departure. "I bring you trouble. This I did not want." But Sarah surprised herself with the fierce protectiveness that rose in her chest. She stood carefully, settling the baby in her makeshift cradle, and moved to the window. Through the frost-etched glass, she could see Bill Patterson and his sons approaching, their faces set with the particular hardness men wore when they believed themselves righteous. "No," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "You brought me life when I thought mine was over. You brought me purpose. Let them come with their narrow minds and bitter hearts. This is my home, and you are welcome here." Joseph stared at her with something approaching wonder, as if her words had revealed a strength he had not expected. Outside, the horses drew closer, their hoofbeats marking time like a funeral drum. Sarah straightened her shoulders and prepared to face a reckoning she had not chosen but would not flee. The knock came hard and demanding, rattling the door in its frame. Sarah opened it to find Bill Patterson's weathered face twisted with disapproval, his sons flanking him like bookends of prejudice. Their eyes swept past her to where Joseph stood near the fire, his posture alert but non-threatening. "Sarah Morrison, what in the devil's name are you thinking? Harboring a savage in your home?" Bill spat, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Folks in town are worried sick about you. This Indian could slit your throat while you sleep." Sarah felt her spine straighten with a strength she had forgotten she possessed. These men saw only Joseph's heritage, blind to his gentleness, his devotion to his children, his careful respect for her grief and space. They feared what they refused to understand. "Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice cutting through the cold air like steel, "this man came to me with starving infants. He has shown me nothing but courtesy and gratitude. If you're so concerned about threats to my safety, perhaps you should look to your own hearts and the poison they carry." The baby boy chose that moment to cry, his voice piercing the tense silence. Joseph moved instantly to comfort his son, his large hands infinitely gentle as he lifted the tiny bundle. The sight of such tenderness seemed to surprise Patterson's younger son, whose hard expression wavered slightly. "Have you ever had to stand up for what you knew was right, even when everyone around you demanded you choose the easier path?" Sarah felt the weight of such a moment settling on her shoulders like a mantle she had never expected to wear. After the men rode away, their threats hanging in the air like storm clouds, Joseph began gathering his few belongings with quiet determination. Sarah watched him fold the blanket she had given him, his movements careful and deliberate, as if each action was a small goodbye. The twins slept peacefully in their makeshift cradles, unaware that their brief sanctuary was ending. "I must go," Joseph said without looking at her, his voice hollow with resignation. "They will return with more men. You have been kind, but I cannot let you suffer for my presence. My children and we will find another way." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had buried a husband and child, had survived months of crushing loneliness, but the thought of losing this unexpected family felt like it would destroy what remained of her heart. She moved to block his path to the door, her hands trembling with emotion she could no longer contain. "No," she whispered, then louder, "no. I have lost everyone I ever loved. I will not watch you walk away and take these babies from me. I will not let fear decide how I live what remains of my life." Joseph stopped, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. In the firelight, she saw her own desperate need reflected back at her, the same yearning for belonging that had driven him to her door in his darkest hour. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice breaking on her name, "you do not know what you are choosing." "I am choosing love," she replied, the words surprising them both with their simple truth. The riders returned at dusk, their torches cutting through the gathering darkness like angry stars. Sarah counted 8 men this time, their voices rough with whiskey and righteousness. Joseph stood at the window, his jaw set with grim determination as he watched them dismount and form a semicircle around the cabin. "Sarah Morrison," Bill Patterson's voice boomed across the yard, "you got 1 hour to send that redskin packing, or we'll drag him out ourselves. This is your last warning." Joseph turned from the window, his face etched with pain deeper than physical wounds. "Sarah, take the babies to the back room. Lock the door. Do not come out no matter what you hear." But Sarah moved instead to stand beside him, her small hand finding his larger one. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The twins stirred in their cradles, sensing the tension that filled the cabin like smoke from a bitter fire. "They want to destroy this," Joseph said quietly, gesturing toward the peaceful scene they had created. "They cannot understand that love has no color, no boundaries. They fear what they cannot control." Through the window, Sarah could see the men growing restless, their torches weaving patterns of threat in the darkness. One of them fired a shot into the air, making both babies cry. The sound of their distress cut through Sarah's heart like a blade, strengthening her resolve. "Then we leave," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "All of us, together. We find somewhere they cannot follow, somewhere our children can grow up without hatred poisoning the air they breathe." Sarah stepped onto her porch, cradling the baby girl against her chest while Joseph held his son. The torchlight cast dancing shadows across her face, but her voice rang clear and strong through the mountain air. The assembled men shifted uneasily, perhaps surprised by her calm dignity in the face of their threats. "You speak of danger," she called out, her words carrying the weight of months of grief transformed into purpose. "But I see no danger in a man who comforts crying babies in the night. I see no threat in someone who mends my broken shutters and asks for nothing in return. The only poison I see here tonight comes from hearts too small to recognize love when it stands before them." Young Tom Patterson, barely 18 and clearly uncomfortable with his father's methods, lowered his torch slightly. His gaze lingered on the peaceful babies, on the obvious tenderness with which both Sarah and Joseph held them. The sight seemed to war with whatever hatred his father had tried to plant in his mind. "This man lost his wife," Sarah continued, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. He came to me with nothing but love for his children and desperation to keep them alive. If that makes him dangerous, then we have lost our way as a people. Have any of you ever found the courage to stand up for something that mattered, even when your voice shook and your knees trembled? Sarah felt that courage flowing through her now, borrowed strength from somewhere deeper than fear. Several men began to murmur among themselves, doubt creeping into their righteous certainty like cracks in winter ice. The torches flickered uncertainly as doubt spread through the group like ripples across still water. Tom Patterson stepped forward, his young face earnest in the firelight. "Pa, maybe we should listen. Mrs. Morrison ain't never done nothing wrong by anybody. If she says this man is good, maybe we ought to trust her judgment." Bill Patterson's weathered face contorted with anger at his son's defiance, but other voices began to murmur agreement. Sarah saw the moment when fear began to lose its grip on reason, when the sight of two people caring for helpless babies spoke louder than prejudice. As the men slowly began to disperse, their threats deflating like punctured balloons, Sarah felt Joseph's free arm encircle her waist. Together they stood on the porch, two souls who had found each other across impossible circumstances, their children safe in their arms. "Sarah," Joseph said quietly after the last torch disappeared into the darkness, "I came here seeking milk for my babies. But you have given me something I thought was lost forever. You have given me hope. You have given me love. Will you be my wife? Not just the mother of my children, but the keeper of my heart." The words hung between them like a bridge spanning two worlds. Sarah looked into his dark eyes and saw her own future reflected there. A future built on trust and tenderness rather than convention. The babies cooed softly, as if blessing the moment with their innocent presence. "Yes," she whispered, sealing their fate with a single word that carried the weight of forever. Spring arrived with a symphony of birdsong and the gentle whisper of new grass pushing through thawed earth. Sarah stood in her garden, now expanded and flourishing under Joseph's careful tending, watching their twins take their first wobbling steps across the sun-warmed ground. At 10 months old, they had grown plump and healthy, their laughter filling the mountain air like music. "Mama," the little girl called, her arms outstretched toward Sarah, the word falling from her lips in perfect English. A moment later, she repeated it in Apache, the syllables Joseph had taught her flowing naturally from her tiny mouth. Both languages belonged to her now, just as both worlds had shaped her beginning. Joseph emerged from the cabin he had expanded over the winter months, adding rooms for their growing family and a workshop where he crafted furniture that townspeople now commissioned with grudging respect. His smile when he saw Sarah holding their daughter lit his entire face with contentment. The sound of approaching horses no longer filled them with dread. Tom Patterson had become a regular visitor, bringing news from town and often staying for Sarah's cooking and Joseph's quiet wisdom. Even his father had grudgingly acknowledged their union after seeing the obvious happiness that radiated from their home. As I watched this family that began with such desperate circumstances bloom into something beautiful and strong, I find myself wondering what this story means to you. What message do you take from Sarah and Joseph's journey from strangers to soulmates, from broken hearts to healing love? Sometimes the greatest families are not born but chosen, built on foundation stones of courage and compassion rather than convention.